You stand on a London street corner on a bright July morning in 1978, watching a young man with long dark hair swing his leg over a massive motorcycle that shouldn't exist, and you realize that some people are born to run from everything their family expects them to become, while others spend their whole lives trying to. Sirius Black has just graduated from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry exactly 3 weeks ago, and the diploma might as well be a Declaration of Independence signed in rebellious ink, because every choice he makes now is a calculated middle finger to the pure-blood supremacy his mother tried to beat into him with words sharper than curses. You watch him kick the motorcycle to life, and the engine roars with a sound that mingles magic and muggle engineering in a way that would make Walburga Black faint into her portrait frame, which honestly seems like a design feature rather than a bug. The bike lifts 3 feet off the ground, hovers there with a gentle hum that sounds like freedom tastes, and you find yourself wondering if this is what it feels like to finally breathe after being underwater for 17 years. Sirius grins, and it's the kind of smile that belongs on the face of someone who has just realized that his family's money, which he inherited from a favorite uncle who saw through the Black family madness, means he doesn't have to go crawling back to Grimmauld Place ever again. The flat he shares with James Potter in a slightly dodgy part of London is small, probably violates several housing codes both magical and mundane, and smells perpetually of the experimental spells they practice at 3 in the morning when sleep seems like surrender. But it's his in a way that 12 bedrooms in a townhouse never were. You follow him as he accelerates down the street, weaving between cars that can't see him thanks to a disillusionment charm that would make his old professors weep with pride, and the wind whips his hair back from his face in a way that makes him look exactly like the paintings of ancient Black family heroes, except with significantly better intentions. The world is at war, though most people don't know it yet, because Voldemort's rise has been gradual, insidious, creeping through the wizarding world like poison through groundwater. And you notice how Sirius's smile fades just slightly when he passes groups of witches and wizards who huddle together speaking in hushed tones about disappearances and dark marks and families that vanished overnight. In 1978, the United Kingdom was still dealing with the economic aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis, with inflation running rampant and the winter of discontent looming on the horizon, which makes it grimly funny that wizards were facing their own crisis, while the Muggle world worried about rubbish piling up in the streets and bodies going unburied. Sirius lands the motorcycle outside a pub in Diagon Alley, and you walk beside him into the dim interior where James Potter is already waiting at a corner table with Remus Lupin and Peter Pettigrew, the 4 Marauders reunited in the way that only happens when friendship has been forged through 7 years of shared detention, illegal animagus transformations, and the kind of loyalty that seems quaint until you remember they're about to need it more than they can possibly imagine. James waves him over with the casual arrogance of someone who has never doubted his place in the world, which is either a blessing or a curse depending on how the story ends. And Remus looks up from a copy of the Daily Prophet with the kind of exhausted wariness that comes from reading about attacks on creatures like himself every morning over breakfast. Peter laughs at something James says, and the sound is just slightly too loud, too eager, in a way that you might remember later when you're trying to figure out where everything went wrong. They're celebrating, sort of, because Sirius and James have just accepted positions as full-time Order of the Phoenix members, which is Dumbledore's polite way of saying, "Welcome to the underground resistance. Here's your extremely high chance of dying before you turn 25. The Order of the Phoenix was founded by Albus Dumbledore around 1970, making it roughly 8 years old at this point, which in terms of secret resistance organizations is either remarkably young or surprisingly ancient, depending on your perspective and mortality rate. You listen as they trade jokes about their new roles, with James making a crack about finally having a job that his parents would approve of if it weren't completely illegal and potentially fatal, and Sirius responding that at least they're not working at Gringotts where the goblins judge you for your vault balance, which gets a genuine laugh from Remus despite his obvious concern. The thing about the Marauders is that they turn everything into a joke, because the alternative is acknowledging that they're basically children playing at war, except the casualties are real and mounting, and there's no teacher to step in when things go too far. You notice how Sirius's hand keeps moving to his wand holster, an unconscious gesture that speaks to hours of practice and preparation. And you remember that he might laugh like he's invincible, but he trains like he expects to die. The conversation shifts to recent order missions, and you learn that Sirius has already participated in 3 operations to evacuate Muggle-born families before Death Eaters could find them, which sounds heroic until James mentions that one of those families refused to leave and was found dead 2 days later, and suddenly the laughter dies in your throat like smoke in rain. There's a weird historical parallel here to the French resistance during World War II, which also consisted largely of young people who went from students to soldiers overnight and had to learn that courage and mortality are not mutually exclusive concepts. Sirius orders another round of butterbeer, which seems inadequate for the moment but also perfectly appropriate, because what else do you do when the world is ending and you're 20 years old and your best friend just proposed to his girlfriend and life keeps insisting on happening even when death is the headline? You watch him glance around the pub with practiced paranoia, noting exits and potential threats, and you realize this is what it means to be Sirius Black in 1978. Every room is a tactical situation. Every stranger is a potential enemy. Every goodbye might be permanent, but you still show up to the pub on Thursday because the alternative is letting the darkness win before the fight has even really begun. James raises his glass in a toast to something suitably dramatic, like living forever or dying memorably, and Sirius clinks his glass against the others with a grin that doesn't quite reach his eyes anymore because he's already seen too much to believe in forever, but he's not quite ready to accept the dying part either. You follow them out into the summer evening, watching how they walk close together in that way that boys who've survived 7 years of boarding school always do, their shoulders almost touching, and you notice how Sirius keeps to the outside of the group, positioned to be the first line of defense if something attacks, which is either admirable or devastating depending on how long you think about it. The motorcycle waits where he left it, illegal and magnificent, and as Sirius swings his leg over the seat again, you catch a glimpse of the future he's riding toward, full of midnight rescues and narrow escapes and the kind of desperate heroism that only makes sense when everything else has already failed. The engine roars to life again, and he accelerates into the sky above London, climbing higher than is probably safe, and for just a moment he's outlined against the sunset, like a figure from a myth, about a boy who flew too close to the sun, except this boy knows exactly how hot the flames are, and he's heading toward them anyway because someone has to, and it might as well be him. You materialize outside a cottage in Cornwall on a night so dark that the stars look like puncture wounds in the sky, and you watch Sirius Black crouch behind a garden wall while Death Eaters circle a building that contains a family who trusted the Ministry to protect them and learn too late that bureaucracy moves slower than murder. The Order of the Phoenix operates on intelligence gathered from informants, careful surveillance, and what Dumbledore calls reasonable paranoia, which is a headmaster's way of saying trust no one and sleep with your wand under your pillow. You count 4 Death Eaters in their distinctive masks and robes, which seems like overkill for attacking a couple and their 3 children, but then you remember that overkill is sort of the Death Eater brand identity, along with theatrical entrances and an embarrassing fondness for snake imagery. Sirius signals to James Potter, who's hidden behind a tree about 20 yards away, and to Mad-Eye Moody, who's probably hidden somewhere you can't even see because he's paranoid enough to be invisible, even when he's standing right next to you. The plan, such as it is, involves creating a diversion while Remus Lupin evacuates the family through a back window, which sounds simple until you remember that these people have to pack their entire lives into bags they can carry while their children cry, and Death Eaters literally try to break down their front door. You watch Sirius transform into a massive black dog, which is convenient for sneaking around, and also very on the nose in terms of naming, since his family has been obsessed with astronomical nomenclature for centuries, and Sirius is the dog star, though you doubt ancient astronomy was thinking about animagus forms when they named it. The transformation is instantaneous and looks absolutely nothing like the painful werewolf transformations that Remus endures monthly, which seems unfair but also explains why Sirius spent 5th year perfecting this ability instead of studying for his UWLs like a normal person. As a dog, he can slip through shadows that wouldn't hide a person, and you follow his canine form as he circles around to the back garden where the family is being ushered out through a window by Remus, who's speaking in low, urgent tones about port keys and safe houses and how they can't take the pet cat, which makes the youngest child start crying harder because apparently evacuation is fine, but leaving Mr. Whiskers is where she draws the line. James creates the promised diversion by sending a spectacular explosion of red and gold sparks over the cottage, which is beautiful in a please don't notice the fleeing family sort of way. And you watch the Death Eaters spin toward the display with their wands raised like this is exactly the kind of obvious trap they absolutely should not fall for, but will anyway, because apparently evil doesn't always correlate with intelligence. Sirius, still in dog form, positions himself between the family and any pursuers, and you can see his canine teeth bared in a snarl that promises violence to anyone who gets too close to these people he's never met, but would die protecting, because that's apparently who he is now. The fascinating historical parallel here is to the Underground Railroad in America before the Civil War, where conductors routinely risked execution to move people from slavery to freedom, which proves that human decency has a long tradition of being technically illegal. The family reaches the port key, an old boot that Dumbledore has enchanted to take them to a safe house in Scotland, and you watch the mother grab her children close while her husband looks back at the cottage that holds 20 years of memories and whispers something that might be a goodbye, or a curse, or both. They disappear with the characteristic hook-behind-the-navel sensation of port key travel, and Sirius transforms back into human form, just as the Death Eaters realize they've been duped and start firing curses in every direction with the accuracy of stormtroopers and twice the murderous intent. You hit the ground next to Sirius as a purple curse sizzles overhead, and he laughs, actually laughs, because apparently mortal danger is his idea of a good time, which is either incredibly brave or pathologically reckless, or possibly both at once. James appears at his side with a crack of apparition, and together they start returning fire with practiced precision, their curses coordinated from years of fighting together in a much lower-stakes way against Slytherins in school corridors. Mad-Eye Moody charges in from some impossible angle, bellowing about constant vigilance, which is his solution to every problem and honestly not terrible advice when people are literally trying to kill you. The fight is brief, brutal, and utterly ridiculous, because the Death Eaters apparently didn't expect actual resistance and flee after Moody hits one of them with a curse that makes him start tap dancing involuntarily, which would be funnier if you weren't acutely aware that these people will murder children in their beds tomorrow night if given the chance. You stand in the sudden silence listening to Sirius breathe hard, watching him check James for injuries with hands that shake just slightly, and you realize this is what order work actually looks like stripped of the noble rhetoric. It's terrified families and close calls and going home at dawn wondering if you saved enough people to balance the scales against the ones you couldn't reach. Sirius looks at the cottage, now quiet, and makes a joke about how the Death Eaters really need to work on their element of surprise, which gets a weak laugh from James but doesn't quite cover the fact that his hands are still shaking. The second mission you witness happens 3 weeks later in a different part of Britain, because the Death Eaters are nothing if not persistent. And apparently, there's a whole list of families marked for elimination based on blood status, which is exactly as horrifying as it sounds. This time, the target is a wizard family who's been publicly critical of pure blood supremacy, which is apparently grounds for execution in Voldemort's version of social order. You watch Sirius conduct surveillance for hours before the operation, sitting on his motorcycle in the sky under a disillusionment charm, watching the patterns of people coming and going from the house, noting every detail with the kind of obsessive attention that keeps people alive in war zones. The thing about Sirius Black that people often miss behind the aristocratic cheekbones and the rebellious attitude is that he's genuinely smart, tactically brilliant in the way that comes from spending your childhood learning to navigate a household full of dark wizards who would curse you as soon as look at you. He's mapped every exit, identified potential ambush points, and calculated response times for Auror backup, which won't come because the Ministry is either compromised or incompetent or both. When the attack comes, it comes fast, and you're running beside Sirius as he sprints toward the house with James and Lily Potter, who's recently joined the Order despite being Muggle-born herself, or perhaps because of it. Lily's presence adds a particular urgency because everyone knows that Death Eaters see people like her as special targets, which makes her participation either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, and you're starting to realize that in this war, those two things are basically the same. The family is already under attack when you arrive, and you see Sirius blast the front door off its hinges with a reductor curse that probably uses more force than strictly necessary, but definitely gets the point across. Inside, it's chaos, with furniture overturned and children screaming and a Death Eater standing over a fallen man whose wand lies just out of reach on the floor. Sirius doesn't hesitate, doesn't dramatic monologue, just hits the Death Eater with a full-body bind curse and keeps moving because there are more threats and more people to protect, and absolutely no time for anything except the immediate tactical problem of not dying while preventing murder. You follow him through the house as he and James clear rooms with military precision, and you note that Dumbledore has clearly been training them because this is not how teenagers fight. This is how soldiers move. And the fact that they had to become soldiers at 20 is something you file away in the category of tragedies too large to think about right now. They find the rest of the family barricaded in an upstairs bedroom, and Lily is already working on evacuation procedures while Sirius and James hold the stairs against two more Death Eaters who've just apparated into the ground floor. The duel that follows is sharp, vicious, and entirely without the ceremonial bow and wait for the signal nonsense that characterized wizard dueling for centuries, because apparently all-out war has a way of stripping away the formalities and leaving just the raw desperation of people trying very hard not to die. Sirius fights with a style that's part aristocratic training and part street brawl, mixing sophisticated spell work with creative cursing that would make his Hogwarts professors proud and his mother apoplectic. A green curse misses his head by inches, and he doesn't even flinch, just rolls behind a banister and returns fire with 3 rapid-fire stunners that suggest he's been practicing way more than is probably healthy. The historical context worth noting here is that in 1978, the Troubles in Northern Ireland were at their height, with bombings and sectarian violence making everyday life a calculated risk, which means that Britain had 2 civil wars happening simultaneously, and most people only knew about one of them. The Death Eaters retreat when they realize they're outmatched, disapparating with cracks like breaking bones, and Sirius doesn't celebrate, just immediately runs upstairs to help with the evacuation, because the mission isn't over until everyone is safe, and even then it's not really over because tomorrow there will be another family and another attack and another desperate race against time and murder. You watch the rescued family disappear via portkey, their lives compressed into 3 bags and a carrier with a very angry cat who apparently made the cut this time, and you see Sirius lean against a wall, breathing hard with sweat dripping down his face and blood on his robes from a curse that grazed his shoulder, which he hasn't even mentioned yet because acknowledging injury feels like weakness, and weakness feels like death. James claps him on the back, and Lily heals his shoulder with her wand, while scolding him for being reckless, which he accepts with a grin that suggests reckless is basically his default setting, and she should probably get used to it. The cottage is destroyed, another home turned into a crime scene, and you watch Sirius take one last look around before apparating away into the night, because there's nothing else to do and nowhere to take this anger except into the next mission and the one after that. You lose count of how many operations you witness over the following months, a blur of desperate evacuations and close calls, and families saved by minutes or luck or Sirius Black's absolute refusal to let anyone die on his watch if he can possibly prevent it. Each mission adds another weight to his shoulders, another memory he'll carry, another reason to wake up with his wand in his hand and his heart racing from dreams of the ones they didn't reach in time, but he keeps showing up because the alternative is unthinkable, and someone has to stand between the darkness and the people it wants to consume. You stand in the doorway of a farmhouse in Wales, watching Sirius Black cast protective enchantments around the perimeter with the kind of methodical precision that suggests he's done this so many times the wand movements have become muscle memory, and you realize that the war against Voldemort isn't just being fought in dramatic duels, but in the quiet, unglamorous work of establishing safe houses where hunted families can hide from people who want them dead for the crime of being born to the wrong parents. The network of safe houses that the Order of the Phoenix maintains is remarkably sophisticated, with properties scattered across Britain in locations ranging from remote Scottish Highlands to seemingly ordinary houses on suburban streets where neighbors wave hello and never suspect that the nice family next door is actually 3 different families rotating through on 2-week intervals under Polyjuice Potion. You watch Sirius check the wards for the 3rd time, and when James asks him if he's sure they're strong enough, Sirius responds that paranoia isn't a character flaw when people are actually trying to kill you, which is the kind of logic that's hard to argue with, and also explains why he started carrying 3 wands at all times, like a magical gunslinger from a very weird Western. The safe house network requires constant maintenance, regular check-ins, and a security system that rivals anything the ministry has, which isn't saying much because the ministry's security is apparently held together with paperwork and wishful thinking. You follow Sirius as he apparates from location to location, checking on families, reinforcing enchantments, and occasionally stopping to help a traumatized child with homework, because apparently fleeing for your life doesn't exempt you from learning about the goblin rebellions of the 18th century. The children are always the hardest part, you notice, watching Sirius kneel down to a 7-year-old girl's eye level to explain that the weird, shimmery wall around the house will keep her safe from bad people, using words that are honest enough to be believed, but gentle enough not to traumatize her further than she already is. He's surprisingly good with kids, which makes sense given that he basically raised his brother Regulus emotionally, if not physically, though that particular story ended badly enough that no one mentions it around him anymore, unless they want to see what happens when you crack open the armor of irreverence he's built around his heart. Some of the safe houses are maintained by Order members who live there full-time, like Elphias Doge, who runs a location disguised as a bed and breakfast where the guests never leave, and the breakfast is always the same, because cooking isn't really Elphias's strong suit. But he's loyal and brave, and those qualities matter more than his terrible eggs. Other houses are managed remotely, with Sirius or other Order members stopping by weekly to refresh the wards and check that no one has been discovered, which is a nerve-wracking process because every visit could reveal either relieved families or empty rooms and dark marks on the walls. You watch Sirius teach a Muggle-born teenager how to cast a proper shield charm because the kid's parents can't do magic, and Dumbledore believes everyone deserves the chance to defend themselves. Even if official ministry policy says underage magic is forbidden, which seems like a ridiculous thing to worry about when Death Eaters are literally hunting children. The teenager learns fast, desperation being an excellent teacher, and Sirius makes a joke about how he learned half his best spells trying to annoy his mother, which gets a smile from the kid and also reveals more about Sirius's childhood than he probably intended. The historical comparison that keeps occurring to you is the safe houses and underground networks that sheltered Jewish families during the Holocaust, ordinary people turning their homes into refuges despite the enormous personal risk, which proves that human decency, in the face of genocide, is both remarkably consistent across time and devastatingly necessary. One particular safe house in the Lake District is run by a witch named Marlene McKinnon, who you watch trade jokes with Sirius. While they reinforce the wards together, their wands moving in complementary patterns that suggest they've practiced this coordination before. Marlene is fierce, funny, and absolutely unafraid to tell Sirius when he's being an idiot, which happens frequently enough that you suspect they might have a thing, except that things seem like a luxury no one can afford when tomorrow is never guaranteed and relationships are just more people to lose. She makes tea while discussing the latest Death Eater attacks with the casualness of someone discussing weather, and you realize this is what happens when horror becomes routine, when you have to normalize the nightmare just to function through another day. Sirius Balzayan her or esques bobspai chili reckon dios inikan isesh echinazan gorsh she hides results with his usual aristocratic carelessness, but you notice how his eyes constantly flick to the windows, checking sight lines, assessing threats, never really resting even when his body looks relaxed. They argue about the best placement for detection charms with the kind of friendly intensity that suggests this is an ongoing debate, and Marlene wins by pulling rank as the person who actually lives here and has to deal with the consequences. If Sirius's creative ward placement accidentally triggers when someone walks to the bathroom at night, the network requires constant communication, which is managed through patronuses that flash through the night, carrying messages about incoming evacuations or compromised locations or Death Eater movements, silver animals bringing news that's rarely good but always necessary. You watch Sirius's Patronus, a dog, because of course it is, bound away into the darkness carrying word that another family is en route to a safe house in Cornwall. And you think about how these silver messengers are the threads holding together a resistance that exists in the spaces between official channels. The ministry, you learn, is worse than useless, actively compromised by people who either support Voldemort's ideology or are too terrified to oppose it, which amounts to the same thing in practical terms. In 1978, Britain was dealing with its own political upheavals, with James Callaghan's Labour government struggling against economic crisis and eventually losing a vote of no confidence in 1979, which demonstrates that wizard and muggle governance can both collapse simultaneously, though for wildly different reasons. Sirius makes dark jokes about how the ministry's response to mass murder has been to form a committee to discuss forming a committee, which would be funnier if people weren't dying while bureaucrats debated procedure. You follow him to a safe house in the Scottish Highlands, so remote that the nearest neighbor is 6 miles away and the nearest Auror is effectively on another planet for all the good they do. This location shelters older wizards and witches who've been targeted for their prominent opposition to Voldemort's ideology, and you watch Sirius sit with them in the evening, listening to stories about the first time Grindelwald rose and how history seems to enjoy repeating itself in increasingly awful ways. an elderly wizard named Caradoc Dearborn talks about fighting in the 1940s and how he thought they'd ended this kind of darkness for good, and Sirius doesn't have the heart to tell him that darkness doesn't end. It just waits for a new generation to forget why it was defeated in the first place. The safe houses become a second home to Sirius, you realize, watching him move through them with the ease of someone who belongs nowhere and everywhere at once, more comfortable in these temporary refuges than he ever was in grim old place, with its shrieking portraits and dark legacy. He brings supplies, reinforces wards, tells jokes to traumatized children, and occasionally breaks down in James's flat afterward because there's only so much horror a person can witness before it starts leaking through the cracks in their defenses. But he always shows up the next day because the work doesn't stop just because you're tired of it. You watch him create a new safe house in an abandoned cottage in Yorkshire, spending 3 days straight laying enchantments with a complexity that would impress professional curse breakers, barely sleeping, surviving on sandwiches that Remus brings him along with increasingly worried suggestions that maybe he should rest. Sirius responds that he'll rest when people stop trying to commit genocide, which is technically an avoidable condition, but not one that seems likely to be met anytime soon. The cottage transforms under his wand work into a fortress that looks like a ruin from the outside, and you marvel at the skill involved because this isn't flashy combat magic, but the intricate, patient work of someone who understands that protection isn't about dramatic gestures, but about thousands of small choices layered together until they form something unbreakable. When he finally finishes, he stands in the middle of the cottage and looks around with satisfaction, and you can see him mentally calculating how many people this space can shelter, how many lives might be saved by 3 days of work and a building that no one else wanted. James apparates in with butterbeer and congratulations, and they drink sitting on the floor of an empty cottage that will soon be full of people who need safety more than they need comfort. The network expands organically, with new locations added as the Death Eater attacks intensify and more families need refuge, and you watch Sirius coordinate with Dumbledore on placement strategies that balance security with accessibility, because what good is a safe house if the people who need it can't reach it before they're killed? Some locations work better than others, and you're present when Sirius has to evacuate an entire safe house in Devon after Death Eaters somehow discover its location. Moving 15 people in 20 minutes through a port key system he sets up on the fly, while James holds off the attackers outside. No one dies, which Sirius counts as a victory, even though the house is lost, and they'll have to start over somewhere else, and you realize that this is what victory looks like in this war. Not triumph, but survival. Not winning, but refusing to lose. He jokes that he's becoming a real estate agent for the perpetually terrified, which makes Remus laugh despite the grimness of the situation, and you think about how humor becomes a weapon against despair when there's nothing else left to fight with. Each safe house represents hope given physical form, a building that says, "You matter, your life has value, we will protect you even if no one else will." And watching Sirius pour himself into this work, you understand that he's fighting not just against Voldemort, but against the ideology that says some people's lives matter more than others based on blood status, which is personal for him in ways that go back to a childhood spent being told he was better than everyone else, until he was old enough to realize that better than is just another way of saying worse than human. You're in the sky over Manchester at 2 a.m, wind screaming past your ears as you cling to the back of Sirius Black's flying motorcycle, and you have approximately 30 seconds to appreciate the absolute insanity of riding a magical motorcycle through clouds before you remember that you're racing toward a house full of Death Eaters who've trapped a family inside and plan to execute them at dawn because apparently genocide works better on a schedule. The motorcycle, a 1977 Triumph Bonneville that Sirius has modified with so many enchantments that it's basically a flying tank with excellent aesthetic sensibilities, banks hard left around a church steeple, and you notice that Sirius is grinning like a maniac, despite the fact that this whole situation is objectively terrifying and possibly suicidal. The bike was a joint project between Sirius and Arthur Weasley, who's fascinated by Muggle technology in a way that sometimes produces brilliant results and sometimes produces exploding tea kettles, and this particular collaboration has yielded a vehicle that can fly, turn invisible, deploy shield charms, and go from 0 to 100 miles per hour in about 3 seconds flat. You've learned that the motorcycle is Sirius's preferred method of transportation for emergency situations because apparition makes noise and portkeys leave traces, and sometimes you need to arrive somewhere fast, quiet, and with enough dramatic flair to make Death Eaters reconsider their life choices when they see a flying motorcycle crash through a second-story window. Tonight's mission is a nightmare scenario where everything that could go wrong has already gone wrong, which seems to be the standard operating procedure for order missions at this point. The family they're trying to rescue sent a Patronus calling for help approximately 45 minutes ago, and since then communication has gone dark, which either means they're hiding and can't risk detection, or they're already dead and you're racing toward a crime scene instead of a rescue. Sirius refuses to consider the second option, which is either admirable optimism or dangerous denial, and you're not sure which, because sometimes the line between hope and delusion is just a matter of timing. The house comes into view, a Victorian monstrosity on the outskirts of town, and you can see the dark mark hanging over it like a neon sign advertising murder, which is exactly as subtle as Death Eaters generally are when they want to make a point. Sirius cuts the engine and the bike glides silently toward the house, benefiting from some enchantment that Arthur definitely didn't learn from any legal manual. And you appreciate that the ministry's ban on flying carpets doesn't extend to motorcycles because apparently the Department of Magical Transportation has very specific blind spots in their regulations. The plan, such as it is, involves Sirius creating a distraction while Mad-Eye Moody and Kingsley Shacklebolt hit the house from ground level. Which sounds reasonable until you remember that Sirius's idea of a distraction usually involves explosions and taunting Death Eaters about their fashion choices, and generally making himself the most obvious target in a 5-mile radius. You watch him hover the motorcycle about 50 feet from a third-floor window, and he makes a joke about always wanting to make a dramatic entrance, which is very on-brand for someone whose family motto is basically, "Look at us being ancient and important," except Sirius has reinterpreted it as, "Look at me crashing through your evil plans on a flying motorcycle." The historical parallel that occurs to you is the RAF pilots during the Battle of Britain in 1940, young men barely out of school, flying against impossible odds to protect people they'd never meet, which suggests that British youth have a long tradition of responding to existential threats by flying directly at them with insufficient backup. Sirius accelerates straight toward the window, and in the 3 seconds before impact, you have time to appreciate that this is absolutely the most Sirius Black thing possible, turning himself into a missile for the cause of justice, and also because he apparently finds near-death experiences emotionally satisfying. The window explodes inward in a shower of glass and wood, and the motorcycle roars into the house at an angle that should be physically impossible, but apparently should be. Doesn't apply when Arthur Weasley does the enchanting. You land in what used to be a bedroom and is now a disaster zone, and Sirius is already off the bike with his wand out, firing curses at the 3 Death Eaters who've spun toward the noise with a kind of delayed reaction that suggests they weren't expecting someone to literally fly through the window at midnight. The fight is immediate, chaotic, and absolutely ridiculous because one of the Death Eaters trips over the motorcycle in the confusion and falls into his companion, which would be slapstick comedy if they weren't trying to murder people, and also shooting killing curses that are turning the wallpaper into smoking ruins. Sirius is laughing while he fights, which is either a coping mechanism or evidence that he's genuinely unhinged, or possibly both, and he makes a comment about the Death Eater's interior decorating skills being as bad as their moral compass, which shouldn't be funny, but somehow is in the way that gallows humor works when the gallows are actively being constructed around you. You hear explosions from downstairs where Moody and Kingsley have made their entrance through more conventional methods that probably involve doors and gravity, and the Death Eaters realize they're surrounded and make the strategic decision to flee, which is sensible but also means they live to murder again another day. Sirius doesn't pursue them, instead immediately searching the house for the family they came to rescue, and you follow him through rooms that show signs of struggle, furniture overturned and scorch marks on the walls, and a child's toy abandoned on the stairs in a way that makes your chest tight. They find the family in the cellar, huddled behind a makeshift barricade of furniture and held together by nothing but terror and a father's shield charm that's been running continuously for 3 hours and is probably the only reason they're still alive. The mother is crying, the father is shaking with exhaustion, and the 2 children are silent in a way that children should never be, and you watch Sirius transform his entire demeanor from wild fighter to gentle protector in the space of a heartbeat. He crouches down to the children's level and tells them that he's got a really cool motorcycle outside, and would they like to see it? Which is exactly the right thing to say, because kids care about cool motorcycles more than they care about abstract concepts like mortal danger and political violence. The evacuation happens quickly, the family bundled onto the motorcycle, which Sirius has modified to fit multiple passengers through some expansion charm that probably violates several laws of physics but works perfectly anyway. You're flying through the night again, this time with a family pressed close, heading toward a safe house in Wales while the dark mark slowly fades behind you. The motorcycle handles the extra weight without complaint, and Sirius flies with steady confidence that's reassuring until you remember that he's completely insane and learn to fly this thing through trial and error, which is not typically how one acquires piloting skills for magical vehicles. He makes jokes to keep the children calm, pointing out constellations and making up completely false stories about wizards who live on the moon and commute to Earth for work, which is ridiculous but effective at stopping the crying. The parents hold each other with the desperation of people who just realized how close they came to dying, and you can see them looking at Sirius with a combination of gratitude and disbelief. Like they can't quite process that this laughing, long-haired 20-year-old just saved their lives on a flying motorcycle. You land outside the safe house as dawn starts to color the eastern sky, and Sirius helps the family inside with gentle efficiency, making sure they're settled before he leaves because the work isn't done until everyone is safe and fed and has at least some illusion of security. The missions blur together after a while, you notice, watching Sirius fly from crisis to crisis through the summer and fall of 1978. The motorcycle becoming as much a symbol of the Order's resistance as the Phoenix itself. Some nights it's evacuations, racing families to safety ahead of Death Eater attacks, the bike's speed and maneuverability making the difference between life and death measured in seconds. Other nights it's supply runs, moving potions and wands, and protective enchantments between safe houses, flying low and dark with the disillusionment charm making them nearly invisible, except when moonlight catches the chrome and makes it gleam like a shooting star. You're with him the night he evacuates 7 people from a house in Leeds, packing them onto the motorcycle in a configuration that definitely exceeds the vehicle's intended capacity, but somehow works because magic has a way of expanding to meet desperate need. The flight is terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, the motorcycle straining under the weight, but Sirius's skill keeping them stable, and you arrive at the safe house with everyone intact, and Sirius making jokes about starting an airborne taxi service for endangered families, which makes everyone laugh despite having just fled for their lives. The motorcycle requires constant maintenance, you discover, watching Sirius and Arthur spend hours tinkering with enchantments and muggle mechanics in Arthur's shed, while Molly Weasley brings them sandwiches and pointed reminders that it's 3 in the morning and normal people sleep. Sirius responds that normal people don't have flying motorcycles, which is irrefutable logic, and also completely misses Molly's point about basic human needs like rest. The relationship between the motorcycle and Sirius is almost symbiotic, you realize, watching how he touches it with the same careful attention he gives to his wand, this vehicle that represents freedom and rebellion and the ability to save people when the Ministry won't. It's faster than broomsticks, more maneuverable than apparition, and carries the added benefit of looking absolutely spectacular, which matters more than practical people think, because sometimes morale is the difference between continuing the fight and giving up. You witness a night when everything goes perfectly. A family evacuated before the Death Eaters even arrive, and Sirius flies victory laps over London at dawn. The city spread below in gold and shadow, and for just a moment, the war seems winnable, and the darkness seems temporary, and the motorcycle seems like a chariot carrying heroes instead of a desperate transport for the condemned. The moment passes, as moments do, and you're back to the grinding reality of nightly missions and close calls, and the steady accumulation of people saved that never quite balances against the weight of people lost. But the motorcycle keeps flying. Sirius keeps laughing into the wind, and somewhere in the space between the terror and the joy, there's something that might be called living, a refusal to let the darkness take everything, including the ability to feel alive while fighting it. You're sitting in a kitchen in the Potter house in Godric's Hollow on a rare afternoon when no one is actively being murdered, watching Sirius and James and Remus and Peter play Exploding Snap with the kind of mock seriousness that suggests they're pretending very hard that everything is normal and fine and definitely not falling apart around them. And this is when you understand that friendship becomes a kind of magic all its own when the world outside is determined to destroy everything you love. The Potter House has become an unofficial headquarters for the younger Order members, partly because James's parents are supportive in that way that wealthy wizard families can be when their son decides to fight Dark Lords, and partly because Lily makes excellent tea and refuses to tolerate doom spiraling, despite having more reason for doom than most, given that she's literally on Voldemort's murder list for the crime of being brilliant while Muggle-born. You watch the cards explode with little pops of smoke and light, and Peter flinches every time, even though he knows it's coming, which is either charming nervousness or a concerning indication that he's not handling the stress well, and you file that observation away in the mental folder labeled Things That Might Matter Later. I'm really curious. From which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Sirius has just won the hand through what James insists is cheating, but what Sirius maintains is creative interpretation of the rules, which has basically been his life philosophy since he was old enough to realize that rules are suggestions that apply to other people. The afternoon light streams through windows that are protected by more enchantments than some Ministry buildings, turning the kitchen golden and warm in a way that feels like borrowed time, like you're all aware that moments like this are luxuries purchased with borrowed futures. Lily is teaching James how to cook something that won't result in magical food poisoning, which is apparently harder than defeating dark wizards based on James's frustrated gestures with a wooden spoon, and you can hear her laughing at whatever terrible joke he's just made, because their relationship seems to be built on equal parts love and her tolerance for his absolute nonsense. Remus looks tired in that way he always does the week before the full moon, with shadows under his eyes that suggest pain is coming and he's bracing for it. And Sirius keeps glancing at him with concern that he thinks he's hiding, but absolutely isn't, because subtlety has never been among his numerous talents. The conversation drifts through topics both serious and ridiculous, From the latest Death Eater attacks to whether enchanted chess pieces are conscious enough to feel pain when they're destroyed. And you notice how they all avoid certain subjects like Regulus Black's increasing involvement with the Death Eaters, or the fact that Peter's mother is sick, and he's torn between order duties and family responsibilities, or the way that marriages and relationships seem impossible to sustain when everyone might die tomorrow. These quiet moments are as much a part of the resistance as the midnight raids, you realize, watching how they hold each other together through shared history and terrible humor and the unspoken agreement that they will protect each other even if protecting everyone else becomes impossible. There's a Muggle historical parallel in the concept of rest and relaxation during World War II, when soldiers were pulled back from the front lines specifically because human beings cannot maintain constant combat readiness without eventually shattering, though the Ergotabots oder Messiah dures, Godiran Science ten immobilisbos kraut trusts, if a faisiarum segethem seist, irenonerus discharging soskers amispars. But the with Asin out and seems determined to prove that wizards can run on caffeine and desperate determination indefinitely. Sirius makes a joke about how they should all go on vacation to somewhere tropical where the only Dark Lord is sunburn. And James agrees enthusiastically while Lily points out that they'd all be murdered within a week because none of them can relax even when they're supposed to, which is accurate enough that no one bothers denying it. The afternoon stretches on in golden domesticity, and you watch Sirius help Lily with dinner preparation despite having absolutely no cooking skills whatsoever, his contribution mostly involving cutting vegetables into shapes that Lily insists are creative, but which look more like abstract art made by someone who's never seen a carrot before. Peter is reading the Daily Prophet with increasing agitation, and when James asks what's wrong, he just shakes his head and says, "The ministry still isn't doing anything useful," which has become such a common complaint that it's basically a greeting at this point. Remus is organizing order reports with methodical precision, creating filing systems that no one else will use, but which make him feel like there's some order in the chaos, which is a coping mechanism that's at least more productive than Sirius's coping mechanism of flinging himself at danger until something breaks. The thing about this group is that they're achingly young, barely into their 20s, and they're trying to hold together a resistance against a dark wizard whose name most people won't even speak, and the disconnect between their age and their responsibility creates a weird emotional space where they're simultaneously fighting a war and arguing about whose turn it is to do dishes. You watch them through the evening as the conversation flows, and someone brings up the time they snuck into the Slytherin common room in 5th year, and suddenly everyone is laughing so hard that Lily threatens to ban reminiscing about school if they're going to be this immature about it. Sirius does an impression of Snape that's cruel and accurate in equal measure, and James laughs until he chokes on his tea, and Peter adds details that make the story even more ridiculous. And for just a moment, they're not soldiers or heroes or anything except friends who share history. The evening darkens outside, and reality seeps back in through the windows despite the wards, and you see them all remember simultaneously that Caradoc Dearborn has been missing for 3 days and probably isn't coming back, and there's a funeral next week for a family they couldn't save in time. The mood shifts, not breaking, but bending, and Sirius stands up to leave because he has watch duty at a safe house, and Remus needs to prepare for the moon, and Peter promises to check on his mother and James, and Lily are left alone in their warded house that feels simultaneously like a fortress and a trap. You walk with Sirius to his motorcycle, and he pauses before mounting it, looking back at the house with an expression that suggests he's trying to memorize this moment, this feeling of warmth and friendship and belonging, like he knows that these moments are finite and shrinking. He makes a joke about how sentimental he's getting in his old age, which is absurd because he's 20 years old, and calling that old age is either dark humor or a concerning acceptance of life expectancy in wartime. The motorcycle roars to life, and you're flying through the night again, but this time towards safety rather than danger, carrying Sirius toward a safe house where he'll spend the night checking wards and probably not sleeping, because sleep feels like surrender when there's always more work to do. But for a few hours this afternoon, there was laughter in a kitchen, and friends who've survived everything together so far, and that has to count for something in the grand calculation of whether hope is justified or just another luxury that war will eventually repossess. You think about the way Sirius smiled in that kitchen, genuinely smiled in a way that reached his eyes, and you realize that these moments are what he's fighting for more than abstract concepts like justice or peace. He's fighting for the right of his friends to sit in kitchens and laugh at stupid jokes and be young in a way that the war keeps trying to steal from them. The night is cold and clear, stars overhead like pinpricks in black velvet, and somewhere below Death Eaters are planning attacks, and Voldemort is consolidating power, and the Ministry is holding meetings that accomplish nothing except the consumption of biscuits and the generation of paperwork. But right now, in this moment, Sirius Black is flying through the darkness toward a house full of people who are alive because of him, and he's thinking about his friends and their laughter and the way James looked at Lily when he thought no one was watching, and those thoughts are armor against the darkness, in a way that all the protective enchantments in Britain could never be. You land outside the safe house, and Sirius checks the wards one more time, thorough and careful despite the late hour. Because thoroughness is how people stay alive, and carelessness is how they end up as obituaries in the Daily Prophet. The family inside is asleep, safe for tonight at least, and Sirius settles into watch duty with his wand across his knees, and his thoughts full of exploding snap and kitchen laughter and the precious, temporary joy of an afternoon stolen from the war. You're in a safe house in November when everything starts to unravel, watching Sirius pace the floor with the kind of restless energy that suggests he's caged and dangerous and one piece of bad news away from exploding. And you realize that paranoia has stopped being a precaution and started being the only reasonable response to a situation where friends are dying and someone in the Order is feeding information to the Death Eaters, and trust has become a luxury no one can afford anymore. The discovery of the spy happened 3 weeks ago when a planned Order operation was ambushed with the kind of precision that only comes from inside information. And now every meeting is thick with suspicion, and every glance carries the weight of accusation. And the Order is tearing itself apart from the inside faster than Voldemort could manage from the outside. You watch Sirius study everyone with eyes that have lost their usual humor, and he makes dark jokes about trusting no one except James. But even that feels like tempting fate because the spy could be anyone and has proven capable of betraying people they've fought beside for years. Mad-Eye Moody has gone from paranoid to actively unstable, which is saying something given his baseline, and he's started testing people's drinks for poison and checking their wands for signs of dark magic, and generally treating every Order member like a potential traitor, which is either brilliant caution or the complete breakdown of organizational cohesion depending on your perspective. The historical parallel that keeps occurring to you is the paranoia in Stalin's Soviet Union during the purges, where the fear of traitors became more destructive than the traitors themselves. Though at least in this case, there definitely is a spy, instead of just manufactured conspiracy. You're present at an Order meeting where Dumbledore tries to calm tensions by explaining that suspicion without evidence helps Voldemort more than the spy does, which is logical and completely useless, because logic has no power over the fear that the person next to you might be the reason your friends are dead. Sirius argues that they should implement mandatory Veritaserum testing for all members, which sparks an immediate debate about rights and privacy and whether fighting dark wizards justifies using dark methods. And you can see the Order splitting along fault lines of principle versus pragmatism that have probably ended more resistance movements than actual defeat has. The spy has been careful, you notice, watching how the leaked information is selective enough to cause damage without being obvious enough to expose the source, which suggests intelligence and patience and probably the kind of long-term planning that Voldemort is famous for. Several Order members have died in the past month alone, walking into what they thought were safe situations only to find Death Eaters waiting, and at the funeral Sirius stands silent and angry in a way that's more frightening than his usual reckless action because anger, looking for a target, is dangerous in ways that even he might not control. Remus Lupin becomes a suspect simply because he's a werewolf and therefore an outsider, which is exactly the kind of prejudice they're supposed to be fighting against, but which becomes a convenient explanation when people are desperate to blame someone for their fear. You watch Sirius defend Remus with the kind of fury that suggests anyone who accuses his friend will find themselves hexed first and questioned later, but even he can't completely hide the moment of doubt that flickers across his face because the spy could be anyone. And Remus has been missing from several meetings, and doubt is a poison that spreads faster than killing curses. The investigation into the spy becomes all-consuming, with Dumbledore quietly running parallel investigations through different Order members to prevent the spy from knowing they're being hunted, which would be clever except that it means no one knows who else is investigating and everyone suspects everyone else of being the investigation target. Sirius throws himself into the search with obsessive intensity, cross-referencing mission reports and attendance records, and trying to find the pattern that will reveal the traitor. And you watch him work through nights without sleeping because sleep means stopping, and stopping means thinking about who it might be, and that way lies madness. Peter Pettigrew has been acting strangely, you notice, more withdrawn than usual, missing meetings with excuses about his sick mother, and when he does attend, he sits on the edges of conversations like he's listening more than participating, which could be guilt or could be grief or could be the normal behavior of someone who's overwhelmed by a war he never asked to fight. You remember that in 1978, the Cold War was approaching its peak intensity with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan coming the following year, which means that Britain was living through two separate experiences of ideological conflict and espionage paranoia, though only one of them had the courtesy to make it into the history books. The safe houses become less safe as people wonder if their locations have been compromised, and you watch families moved in the middle of the night to new locations that fewer people know about. The network shrinking as trust becomes a scarce resource. Sirius makes a joke about how at least constant suspicion means he doesn't have to feel guilty about his natural paranoia anymore. But the joke falls flat, because everyone in the room is thinking the same thing, and humor has stopped being an effective defense against horror. Dumbledore calls a meeting in December, and you're there when he announces that they need to implement new security measures, including unbreakable vows for senior members and memory charms to compartmentalize information, and the fact that he's suggesting these measures tells you exactly how desperate the situation has become. The debate that follows is vicious, with Sirius arguing that they can't fight tyranny by becoming tyrannical, and Moody countering that dead people don't have principles, and maybe survival matters more than purity of method. You watch James try to mediate, his usual cheerfulness strained by the weight of watching his friends turn on each other, and Lily sits silent with her hand on her wand, because she knows that, as a Muggle-born, she's on the periphery of trust no matter what she does. The meeting ends without resolution, everyone apparating away into the night carrying their suspicions with them, and you follow Sirius as he flies to a safe house and proceeds to dismantle and rebuild all the wards, because if he can't control who's betraying them, he can at least control whether the wards will hold if they're attacked. He works with methodical fury, and when James shows up around midnight to check on him, they sit in silence for an hour before James finally says that they have to trust someone or the order is already finished. And Sirius responds that trust is how people die, but he'll keep trusting James because some things are worth the risk even when the risk is everything. The spy remains undiscovered through the winter, a ghost in the machine feeding information and death to Voldemort's forces, and you watch the Order shrink as members die or disappear or simply stop showing up to meetings, because fighting an external enemy is one thing, but fighting while looking over your shoulder at your friends is something else entirely. Sirius stops sleeping regularly, you notice, existing on catnaps and pepper-up potions and the kind of manic energy that comes from running on spite and adrenaline. And when Remus tries to convince him to rest, he just laughs and says he'll rest when the traitor is caught or he's dead, whichever comes first. The paranoia affects everyone differently, you observe, watching how some Order members become more isolated while others cling closer to their chosen few, and scholarly debates have emerged about whether resistance movements are more often destroyed by external pressure or internal collapse, with most historians agreeing that the answer is depressingly often both at once. You're with Sirius when he gets the news that Marlene McKinnon's entire family has been murdered, and you watch him transform from human to something carved from ice and fury, and he doesn't say anything for 3 hours, and then he says only that he's going to find the spy and make them pay for every death they've caused, which is either justice or revenge, and probably both, and definitely terrifying. The Order continues because stopping means surrendering, and surrendering means everyone dies. But the joy has gone out of it, replaced by grim determination and the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously. You watch Sirius at Marlene's funeral, standing in the rain beside a row of graves, and he doesn't cry because crying feels like weakness, and weakness feels like giving the traitor power they don't deserve. But his hands shake when he places flowers on the earth, and you know he's adding her name to the list of people he failed to protect, no matter how illogical that guilt might be. The war continues. The spy remains hidden, and trust becomes a memory of easier times when friends were simply friends, and betrayal was something that happened to other people in other wars, and you realize that this is how resistance dies, not with grand battles, but with the slow erosion of everything that made it worth fighting for in the first place. You're standing invisible under a disillusionment charm in Godric's Hollow on October 31st, 1981, and you realize with the kind of sick certainty that comes too late to matter that every terrible decision that led to this moment was made with good intentions and perfect logic and complete ignorance of how catastrophically wrong things could go, and now you're about to watch the worst night in Sirius Black's life unfold, because history doesn't care about warnings or hindsight or the desperate hope that maybe this time the story will end differently. The Potter house sits peaceful under autumn stars, its wards glowing faintly in your magical sight, and inside James and Lily are putting their son Harry to bed with no idea that they have approximately 3 hours left to live, because Peter Pettigrew, their secret keeper, their friend, the person they trusted with literally everything, has betrayed them to Voldemort and is probably sleeping soundly tonight because moral conscience doesn't seem to be something that keeps traitors awake. You've watched this night approach like a slow-motion train wreck for months, watching Dumbledore convince the Potters to use the Fidelius charm to hide their location, watching them choose Peter as secret keeper because Sirius insisted that he was too obvious a choice, and Peter was perfect because no one would suspect him, which turned out to be completely accurate, but not in the way anyone intended. Sirius is miles away right now, checking on a lead about Death Eater activity that you know is a wild goose chase designed to keep him occupied while Voldemort murders his best friend. And the tragedy is that Sirius thinks he's being clever and careful and doing his job, when really he's just absent at the moment he's needed most. You've learned through 3 years of watching that the scholarly debate about whether Voldemort could have been stopped earlier is meaningless because history is written in moments, and this is the moment where everything changes, where the war that seemed endless finally peaks and breaks, but at a cost that makes victory feel like defeat. The night is cold and clear. which seems wrong because surely the weather should reflect the tragedy about to unfold, but nature doesn't care about human suffering any more than fate cares about fairness. You watch Voldemort appear on the street with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being the most powerful dark wizard in a century, and knowing that nothing in this house can stop you because the wards are meaningless when your secret keeper has given you the password. James hears the noise first, you imagine. Probably reaches for his wand, but it's upstairs because who expects to need a wand in their own home on Halloween when they're supposed to be perfectly safe, behind the most powerful protection magic can provide? Lily screams, and the sound carries through the night in a way that will echo through wizarding history as the moment when love proved stronger than death magic, but only after death magic killed almost everyone involved. You can't watch what happens inside the house because some horrors are too intimate for observers, but you see the green flash through the windows, once, twice, and then a third time that somehow backfires in a blast of magic that destroys half the house and leaves Voldemort apparently dead and Harry Potter alive with a lightning bolt scar that will define his entire life. The silence after the explosion is worse than the screaming, and you stand frozen in the rubble-strewn street, trying to process that James and Lily Potter, who were laughing over dinner yesterday and planning their son's future and believing that they were safe, are dead at 21 years old because they trusted the wrong person. Sirius arrives 17 minutes later, and you watch him land his motorcycle in the middle of the street with a recklessness that suggests he already knows. Some part of him already understands that the world has ended while he was chasing phantoms across Britain. He runs toward the house calling James's name, and his voice breaks on the second syllable in a way that makes your chest hurt because you're witnessing the moment when Sirius Black's heart shatters into pieces that will never quite fit back together. Hagrid is already there, having arrived on Dumbledore's orders, and he's holding baby Harry, who's crying but alive, miraculously alive, impossibly alive. And Sirius reaches for his godson with hands that shake, but Hagrid backs away because Dumbledore's orders were clear, and in that moment no one trusts anyone because Peter's betrayal has proven that friendship means nothing against the right incentive. You watch Sirius realize that Hagrid thinks he's the betrayer, that everyone will think he's the betrayer because he was supposed to be secret keeper and now James is dead, and who else could have told Voldemort where to find them? And you see him open his mouth to explain about the switch to Peter, but then close it again, because what's the point when no one will believe him and Peter is already gone? The historical comparison that occurs to you, grimly inappropriate, is the aftermath of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, where one event triggered consequences that no one could have predicted, and millions died because of miscommunication and mistrust and the fundamental inability of humans to prevent disasters they can see coming. Sirius makes a decision in that moment that you can see crystallize across his face, a terrible decision driven by rage and grief and the complete absence of anything left to lose, and he demands that Hagrid give him Harry because he's the godfather and he has rights, and he'll protect the boy. But Hagrid refuses because he has orders, and orders are all that make sense when the world has stopped making sense. They argue in the street surrounded by Muggle onlookers who are starting to gather, and finally, Sirius makes a choice that will haunt him for 12 years. He offers Hagrid his motorcycle for transportation, the motorcycle that represents his freedom and his rebellion and everything good about his life, and he lets Harry go, because keeping him means fighting Hagrid, and fighting means attracting attention, and attention means awkward questions about why Sirius isn't dead or arrested. You watch the motorcycle fly away carrying Hagrid and Harry toward a destiny that Dumbledore has planned without consulting anyone involved, and Sirius stands alone in the street looking at the ruined house where his best friend died while Sirius was too far away to help or to die beside him or to do anything except survive when survival feels like punishment. The rage that fills him then is palpable, visible in the set of his shoulders and the way his magic starts to crackle around him in purple-black sparks. And you know with absolute certainty that he's about to do something catastrophically stupid, driven by the need to make someone pay for James and Lily being dead, and Harry being orphaned, and everything good being destroyed. Peter Pettigrew is somewhere in London, probably congratulating himself on his survival instincts and his clever betrayal and his successful navigation of impossible politics by choosing to serve the winning side, except that Voldemort is gone and Peter has just murdered the people who trusted him for literally nothing. You follow Sirius as he apparates across London hunting for Peter with the kind of single-minded focus that predators have when they've scented blood. And you want to stop him, because you know how this ends. You know that Peter will fake his death and frame Sirius for a murder spree. And Sirius will spend 12 years in Azkaban for crimes he didn't commit, while Peter lives as a rat in the Weasley household. But you can't stop him, because you're just an observer in someone else's tragedy, and besides, what could you possibly say that would make him choose differently when his entire world has just been destroyed by the person he trusted to protect it? Ew. The night stretches on, and you watch Sirius search through streets and alleys, and all the places the marauders used to hide, and his face is set in an expression of such cold fury that you barely recognize him as the laughing boy from the kitchen just weeks ago. October 31st, 1981, is the night that Sirius Black loses everything except his rage, and that rage will carry him through the next 12 years in a prison designed to strip away everything human. And the real tragedy is that his suffering will be for crimes he never committed while the real traitor lives safely, and no one even thinks to look for the truth, because Peter Pettigrew is apparently dead, and Sirius Black is apparently a murderer, and sometimes the lie is simpler than the truth. You're on a London street corner the next morning, November 1st, watching Sirius Black confront Peter Pettigrew in front of approximately 47 Muggle witnesses, and you realize with a kind of detached horror that you're witnessing the exact moment when justice gets mistaken for revenge, and the truth gets buried under so many layers of misunderstanding that it will take 12 years and a very determined teenager to dig it back out again. Peter is crying, which would be pathetic if it weren't so calculated, tears streaming down his face as he screams accusations about betrayal and secret keepers, and how could Sirius murder James and Lily? And you notice that Peter has already cut off his own finger because he's thought 3 moves ahead and knows exactly how to stage his death convincingly enough to become a legend while actually escaping as a rat through the sewers. Sirius is laughing, which is the worst possible response in terms of public relations, but makes perfect sense when you understand that he's been up all night hunting Peter and has finally found him, and is so far beyond rational thought that insane laughter is actually a reasonable response to this utterly bizarre confrontation. You watch Sirius raise his wand, and for just a moment, you think he might actually curse Peter into oblivion, which would be murder but also justice, and also completely counterproductive because dead men can't confess to their crimes, and Sirius would be confirming everyone's suspicions about his guilt. Peter moves first, screaming something about avenging Lily and James that makes Sirius's laughter die in his throat, and then Peter fires a blasting curse at the street behind him that explodes with enough force to kill 12 Muggles, destroy several buildings, and create a crater that will be investigated by both Muggle and magical authorities for months. The blast throws you backward, and through the smoke and debris, you see Peter complete his transformation into a rat and disappear into the sewers, leaving behind nothing but a finger and screaming Muggles, and Sirius standing in the center of the destruction, looking like the obvious culprit. The Aurors arrive within minutes, which is actually impressive response time for the Ministry, though you suspect they've been monitoring Sirius since last night, when news of the Potters' deaths broke and suspicion fell on him like a curse. You watch Cornelius Fudge, still a relatively junior Ministry official in 1981, take charge of the scene with the kind of officious certainty that suggests he's more interested in closing the case quickly than investigating it properly, which tracks with everything you'll come to know about his approach to governance. Sirius doesn't resist arrest, which is either smart or evidence of complete emotional shutdown, and you see him laugh again, that same horrible broken laugh. Because what else can you do when your best friend is dead, and his murderer just escaped, and you're about to be arrested for crimes you didn't commit, and absolutely no one will believe the truth, because the truth sounds insane even to you. The historical parallel that occurs to you is the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti in 1920s America. Italian immigrants convicted of murder largely because they were anarchists and foreign and convenient scapegoats for a nervous public, except Sirius doesn't even get a trial because the evidence seems so overwhelming that the ministry decides a trial would be a waste of time. You follow Sirius to the ministry holding cells, and you watch him sit in silence for 3 days before Crouch Sr., the head of magical law enforcement who's been given emergency powers to deal with Death Eaters, decides that Sirius Black is obviously guilty based on circumstantial evidence and eyewitness accounts from Muggles who saw what they expected to see rather than what actually happened. The irony is that Sirius could probably prove his innocence if he used the truth serum or submitted to legilimency, but he doesn't suggest either option because he's slipped into a depression so profound that he's basically catatonic, sitting in his cell, staring at walls, and occasionally laughing at nothing because his entire world has collapsed, and fighting for himself feels pointless when James is dead and Harry is alive. But being raised by Muggles and Peter is free, and everything is wrong in ways that fixing seems impossible. In scholarly circles, there's ongoing debate about whether Barty Crouch Sr. genuinely believed Sirius was guilty or simply needed a high-profile conviction to maintain public confidence in the ministry's ability to handle the Death Eater crisis, with most historians agreeing that the truth probably lies somewhere in that murky middle ground where pragmatism meets injustice. You watch them transfer Sirius to Azkaban prison without trial, without verification, without any of the legal protections that theoretically exist in magical law. And you see him loaded onto the boat that will take him to the island fortress, where Dementors guard prisoners by slowly consuming their happiness and sanity and will to live. The boat ride is silent except for the sound of waves and chains, and Sirius sits absolutely still with his eyes closed, and you wonder if he's remembering James laughing in a kitchen, or Harry's first birthday party, or midnight flights on his motorcycle, or all the moments when he was happy and had no idea that happiness was a temporary condition that could be revoked without warning. Azkaban rises from the North Sea like a monument to despair, all dark stone and darker magic, and even from the boat you can feel the Dementor's presence like ice in your lungs and lead in your heart. The prison is less than 10 years old at this point, having replaced the previous system where prisoners were held on magical prison ships, which suggests that the wizarding world's approach to criminal justice is whatever terrifies people most efficiently. You watch Sirius Black, age 21, be processed into Azkaban, his wand confiscated, his possessions removed, his identity reduced to a number and a cell in a crime he didn't commit. And the worst part is that some piece of him seems almost relieved, because at least in Azkaban, he doesn't have to pretend to be functional, or hide his grief, or explain to anyone that his godson is alive. But he can't protect him, and his best friend is dead, but he couldn't save him, and everything is his fault, even though technically nothing is his fault except trusting Peter, and who could have predicted that Peter would betray everyone to Voldemort. The cell door closes with a sound like finality itself, and Sirius slumps against the wall of a space barely large enough to lie down in, and you realize that this is where his story will pause for 12 years, while the outside world forgets about him except as a cautionary tale about Death Eaters and betrayal. The Dementors circle the prison in lazy patterns, feeding on the prisoner's misery, and Sirius transforms into his dog form because dogs don't feel despair the way humans do, which is a loophole in the Dementor's magic that will keep him sane when everyone else in Azkaban goes slowly insane. You watch him curl into a ball of black fur in the corner of his cell, and you know that he'll spend 12 years here. 12 years of cold and darkness and Dementors, feeding on memories of James and Lily dying while he was too far away to help. 12 years of the truth being locked inside his head with no way to tell anyone, and no reason to believe anyone would listen if he tried. The waves crash against Azkaban's walls with the regularity of heartbeats, and somewhere on the mainland, Harry Potter's being raised by muggles who hate magic, and Peter Pettigrew is living as a rat, planning his next betrayal, and the wizarding world celebrates that Voldemort is gone without understanding that the cost of that victory was nearly everyone who actually fought to achieve it. In scholarly circles, historians debate whether Sirius's imprisonment represents the failure of magical justice or its logical extension, whether denying someone a trial is aberration or feature, whether a society that can do this to one of its heroes is worth defending. And you think about how justice and vengeance and pragmatism and cruelty can become so intertwined that no one can separate them anymore. And everyone involved genuinely believes they're doing the right thing, even as they create new injustices that will require new heroes to fix. The night deepens around Azkaban, and Sirius lies still in his cell, neither sleeping nor waking, just existing in that strange space between consciousness and void where prisoners learn to live when living becomes unbearable. And somewhere in the distance, a Dementor glides past his door, and you feel the cold wash over you like drowning. He thinks about James, probably, about laughter in a kitchen and flying on a motorcycle, and the way James proposed to Lily 17 times before she said yes, about nights spent as a dog running beside a werewolf under full moons, about fighting Death Eaters back to back and knowing that someone had your back literally and figuratively, about all the moments that added up to a friendship that was the realest thing in his life and is now gone, except for the echo it leaves in memory. The Dementors can't take those memories because he's a dog when they try. And in this bizarre way, his animagus form, which he learned as a teenager to help a friend, becomes the thing that saves his sanity when everything else is designed to destroy it. Outside the cell, winter is coming to Britain. The first winter after the war that wasn't really won, just paused. And somewhere Harry Potter is learning to walk in a house where nobody loves him, and Sirius Black is learning how to survive in a prison designed to ensure survival is its own form of torture, and between them lies 12 years of waiting and suffering and questions that won't be answered until a boy with his father's face and his mother's eyes arrives at Hogwarts and begins unraveling the lies that buried the truth. The story could end here, with Sirius in his cell, and Peter escaped and justice perverted into its opposite. But of course it doesn't end here because stories never really end. They just pause between chapters. And this is just the pause before the next chapter where truth fights back against the weight of convenient lies. You watch Sirius transform back to human form just long enough to whisper something that might be James's name or Harry's, or just the sound of grief too deep for proper words. And then he's a dog again, curled small and dark in the darkness, and the night settles over Azkaban like a blanket woven from despair and salt spray, and the sound of waves that will crash against these stones for 12 long years before anything changes. The Dementors glide through their patrols, feeding on misery that seems inexhaustible. Because how can you exhaust the grief of losing everything while being blamed for destroying it? And somewhere above the prison the stars shine cold and distant and indifferent, and if you look carefully, you can still see Sirius, the dog star, burning bright in the constellation that shares his name, a light in the darkness that continues burning